Bienvenue à la réunion.
I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 132 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage.
For instance, I want you all to read the guidelines written on the cards on the table. They are there to help us not to get feedback and actually which creates a problem for interpreters. So we need to know where to put your phone, etc., so that it's not going to create the feedback you want. Now, today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, so that I just want to let you know that there are some following points that we run a committee under, that everything you do is through the chair, that you cannot take photographs of what's going on here. It's going to be online later on for you to look at. That if you want to speak, raise your hand, or if you're in the virtual field, put it up in the hand signal, and the clerk and I will try to make sure that we see you in order that you put up your hand, so that sometimes we miss you, but there you go. We're going to try hard to do this. So, and again, remember that all comments should be addressed to the chair. What we will do is we will ask the speaker to have a certain amount of time to speak. Then when we get to and I will give her Ms. Tate, I will give you a 30-second shout out when you have to wrap it up. And to everyone else, the same thing. I'll give you a 30-second shout out so you know to wrap up what you're doing. And then we will get to the question and answer period. So now, 5 minutes for Ms. Tate or 10? Okay. So welcome, Ms. Tate. We have seen you a lot at this committee now, so we've become quite familiar with you. So I welcome you. You know all the rules. You've been here before. I wanted to say you have 5 minutes to present, and you can go ahead. And after that, we will go to the question and answer period. And I'll give you that 30-second shout out. Are you ready to begin?
I am.
Thank you.
I should just say that I'm here with the chair of the board of directors of CBC Radio-Canada, Michael Goldblum, who will be joining me in opening remarks. Alors, Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs les
Madam
membres
Chair,
du comité,
members of the committee, we are honored to represent Canada's public broadcaster and organizations that Canadians depend on to celebrate Canadian culture and to ensure access to accurate news and information.
I would also remind the committee that CBC Radio-Canada operates at arm's length from government, not just in its editorial decisions, but also in its financial and operational decisions. This independence is critical to the trust that Canadians place in us. We welcome discussions about public broadcasting, and we believe such discussions should be based on facts. The document we have shared with you sets out the facts about compensation at CBC Radio-Canada. We hope these can help guide our conversation today. Nous aimerions profiter du temps qui nous est accordé.
We would like to use our time to talk about the challenges facing the media industry in Canada and why a strong public broadcaster is more important than ever. The challenge is by now clear. The ongoing crisis in Canadian media is undermining Canadians' ability to keep informed. When there are fewer sources of Canadian news, this means that there are increased foreign-owned social media which become more influential with all of the disinformation and conspiracy theories that they tend to bring forth.
This year, Policy Horizons Canada identified the key disruptions facing Canada. Number one is that people will not be able to tell what is true and what is not. How will we as a society solve the big challenges that we face, affordability, housing, climate change, health issues, if Canadians cannot tell what is true? In this period of enormous disruption in Canada's media landscape, I believe Canada needs its public broadcaster more than ever. CBC Radio-Canada provides trusted news and information backed by professional journalists, high journalistic standards, transparency, and accountability. Our local presence in 60 communities in every region of the country allows Canadians to remain connected to each other and to the country. D'après l'étude Réputation 2024
According
de Léger,
to this year's
CBC
Léger
Radio
Reputation
Canada
Survey
est le média
2024,
le plus admiré au
CBC
pays.
Radio Canada is the most
C'est aussi le réseau
admired media
d'information
company in the
considéré
country.
comme le
It
plus
is also
fiable au
Canada's
Canada.
most trusted news
D'après
network,
l'étude
according
2024 de
to
Polaris
Polaris
sur la confiance des
2024
médias.
Trust in Media Study.
Le diffuseur public est également
The
un
public
moteur de la
broadcaster is
culture
also the
canadienne.
backbone of Canadian
Notre
culture.
budget contribue à
Our
stimuler une
annual
industrie
budget
de
contributes to
l'information
an
et de la
information and creative
création qui
economy
génère
that generates
73 milliards de
$73
dollars
billion
par an dans
in
l'économie
the Canadian
canadienne
economy every
et
year.
630
And
000
it provides for
emplois au
jobs for
pays. And
630,000
let's not
Canadians.
forget the thousands of amateur athletes who would remain unknown here at home and on the world stage if not for the public broadcaster's commitment to showcase their talent. What better example than this summer's Olympics and Paralympics in Paris? 27 million Canadians, 7 in 10, came to CBC Radio-Canada to celebrate Canada's athletes. The Olympics gave the lift that all Canadians needed, a truly nation-building event. In other countries, access to Olympic coverage increasingly means paying for it, and coverage is limited to 17 days every other year. But not here in Canada. CBC Radio-Canada's commitment is to year-round coverage of amateur athletes and to gender parity in all sports. Despite the challenges, CBC Radio-Canada continues to meet the changing needs of Canadians. 21 million Canadians now depend on our digital services each month for news. Millions are streaming video and audio in English and French across our platforms. And that's in addition to our award-winning radio and television services. We are serving Canadians. That service is something worth celebrating and certainly worth fighting for. Merci.
Thank you. Oh my goodness, you've done very well, Ms. Tate. I forgot, I'm sorry, my fault, guys. I forgot to introduce Michael Goldblum, who is chair of the board of CBC, and he's here to answer any board-related questions that you may have. We talked about it at the last meeting, actually. So now we will begin with the question session, and I will begin first and foremost with Mr. Kurek. For 6 minutes, please, Mr. Kurek.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Goldblum and Ms. Tate, for joining us here today. Ms. Tate, you were asked to appear before this committee with very specific parameters in the motion surrounding bonuses, or as was referred to by your organization as performance pay. In the fiscal year covering 2022-2023, Ms. Tate, did you receive a bonus?
No.
Is there, now, it's my understanding that, thank you, being direct on that. Now, it is my understanding that there is not a deadline when it comes to there being a bonus awarded outside of a fiscal year. Is that your understanding as well?
Are you talking about compensation for the CEO in your question, or specifically to the entire non-unionized employee group?
Specifically.
So if I may, as you know, the CEO is compensated.
Point of order, Madam Chair. We can't hear Mr. Kurek on the audio. He's cutting in and out. So if you could repeat the question, maybe we could find out what's happening there.
We start from scratch. I think we should try and rectify what's happening. Apparently, the people on the virtual end are telling us that they cannot hear Mr. Kurek's question. He's cutting in and out. That means we may not be able to hear Ms. Tate's answer either. So can we check that out, please? Shall we suspend while that's happening? Yeah? I'm going to suspend while that's happening. Excuse me.
Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Tate and Mr. Goldbloom, for joining us here today. Ms. Tate, again, I would ask, for the fiscal year 2022-2023, did you receive a bonus? Okay, thank you, Ms. Tate. Mr. Goldbloom, did the board request to the government that Ms. Tate receive a bonus?
The board provides its assessment of the CEO's performance, and we share that with the government. It's for the government to decide whether or not it pays a performance pay.
And did the board give the assessment that Ms. Tate should receive a bonus to the government?
I think the specifics of that recommendation is confidential, but I would say the board has been very supportive of Ms. Tate's performance. So,
thank you, Mr. Goldbloom. So, Ms. Tate, I would ask again, and it's my understanding that your term will be coming to a close. I believe January 3rd is the end of that. Now, in terms of performance pay, bonuses, and a severance package, we are in a situation where Canadians are struggling. The cost of living is making it unaffordable for so many Canadians to afford the essentials. Yet, when you look at the bonuses, $18 million awarded across CBC, including averaging tens of thousands of dollars to executives within the organization, yet your metrics certainly don't seem to add up with the talking points that are provided. As you conclude your tenure at CBC, can you commit today that you will not take a severance package or bonuses for the last 2 fiscal years?
You've made several points in that question. What I would say is, first of all, if we're talking about 22-23, all the results of that year are public. For 23-24, all of the key performance indicators set out and approved by the board were achieved, if not exceeded.
Thank you. So with respect, Ms. Tate, I did ask specifically about your compensation. So when the range of compensation that is provided, you make more than the Prime Minister of this country. That's your compensation. So to get a bonus on top of that at a time when viewership is down, ad revenue for your organization is down, I asked specifically about whether or not you would refuse to take a severance package at the conclusion of your term as CEO.
I believe that Canadians would expect that the corporation honor its commitments to its non-unionized employees as it would to its unionized employees, and I would just correct the record. Whereas total ad revenues are down, digital ad revenues are up. Since the beginning of my tenure, which digital revenue was at about 38 million. This last year, it clocked in at about 100 million. So I think it's important that we have accurate descriptors of what's going on at CBC Radio-Canada.
So Ms. Tate, you said that it's confidential, that information, but that just doesn't work for Canadians. Canadians look at $18 million awarded in bonuses, the fact that you just spent $1,000 a night for a hotel room in Paris during the Olympics, and we are in a situation where you are coming to the conclusion of your term being paid more than the Prime Minister of this country makes. And you refuse today to rule out that you will receive either bonuses or so-called performance pay or a severance package at the conclusion of your term. It's confidential, doesn't cut it for Canadians. It doesn't cut it for parliamentary oversight. So again, I ask, will you specifically today share with this committee whether or not you will refuse a severance package or bonus at the conclusion of your term as President and CEO of CBC?
As I've said, I consider that to be a personal matter. And I believe I'm protected by the Privacy Act in that regard.
So Ms. Tate, taxpayers pay your salary, as they do for all of us, and you can Google an MP's salary, you can Google the Prime Minister's salary. But here we are discussing $18 million paid out to bonuses, $3 million paid out to executives. Madam Tate, your own documents show that there are 631 managers at CBC. 43, I believe it is, executives. And you're defending those, the average bonus paid out to executives at your organization is more than most Canadians make in a year, and you're claiming that it's confidential? Madam Speaker, Madam Chair, through you, I would suggest that it is unbelievable that Ms. Tate would come before this committee with a very specific motion outlining that answers are demanded when it comes to the compensation received by a public broadcaster. These are taxpayers' dollars that are paying for this organization. So, again, I will ask and emphasize, Ms. Tate, at the conclusion of your term, whether it's for previous fiscal year's bonuses or so-called performance pay,
30 seconds.
or the conclusion of a severance package, will you refuse that out of respect for the taxpayers that have paid for you to have this role over the last number of years?
I believe I've answered the question, and for the record, I would like to correct some of the errors, in fact, that the member has articulated. One, this $18 million in performance pay is not, these are not dollars that aren't agreed upon well in advance of the end of the fiscal year. We have a rigorous process in place, a process that has been in place for 20 years, Madam Chair. It's a process that is similar to that of other Crown corporations, other government agencies, and most private companies. A process that is guided by third-party consultants that advise us, experts that advise us on what it is we should be paying our executives and our managers.
And how much did those third-party consultants cost?
Mr. Kurek, your time is up. And we'll move on to the second questioner, and that's for the Liberal Party. We have Michael Coteau. Michael, 6 minutes.
Thank you,
please.
Chair, and good morning. Thank you for being here. I agree with you that CBC is a trusted voice of Canadians, and the majority of Canadians, support the CBC. It's a very popular broadcaster, and I think, and I've said this before, I'm a big supporter of the CBC. I think it serves the public good. And in addition to that, in the day of misinformation and disinformation, we need a good public broadcaster that can get out there and really deliver information that's relevant to Canadians. And I think Mr. Goldblum, you said it is a trusted backbone of Canadian culture. It was one of you who said that, but I think it is absolutely true. But what's brought us here today is the $18 million, $18.4 million that was earmarked for bonuses. Before I get into those questions, because you probably remember some of my questions last time, I asked if you'd go back to the board and reconsider the structure, and I'll get into that. But before I go any further, can you explain even the word bonus? Like, explain the process for us. What are we actually talking about? Are these bonuses from your perspective?
No, they are not bonuses. They are what we call performance pay, a portion of the individuals involved. And we're talking about 1,180 non-unionized employees, managers, and executives. A portion of their salary is withheld at the beginning of the year. So let's say you're making $80,000, maybe $10,000
That's
is
in
withheld.
your contract.
It's in
so your contract says I make $80,000.
Correct. And
okay.
you have, and a portion is withheld, and a series of KPIs are established at the beginning of the year.
Can you explain what a KPI is?
Oh, a key performance indicator, and those are linked to the priorities of our strategic plan. So, for example, driving digital engagement in the regions is a KPI. And if we meet the target, those people, those individuals will receive that portion of their performance pay. We have 70% of the performance pay is associated with KPIs, and 30% is associated with the person's individual performance, and they have a manager that oversees their objectives on an annual basis as well.
So I'm going to jump back in for a second. So the last time you were here, I said that, especially considering where Canadians are today, affordability is probably among the top 3 issues in this country, if not the most important issue. When you see headlines saying that $18.4 million is going out to top executives within an organization, it doesn't sit well with Canadians. And Canadians are on your side. There's a bit of talk. Oh, sorry. I couldn't hear. Sorry. It's the chair. I apologize. So the 18.4 million dollars that goes out to top executives, it doesn't sit well with Canadians because they see it as a bonus. The way it sounds like you go out and you do a good job. If you do a really good job, you get some extra money. It's no matter which way you slice it, it sounds like a bonus, right? And that's the challenge. The last time you were here, I asked if you go back to the board and you would think about restructuring your system so it was a little bit more, I would say, supportive with the average Canadian who is struggling right now, because $18.4 million to executives during hard times is hard for Canadians to process. Have you gone back to the board and had the discussion? Was there a discussion at the board, and is there any developments in that area?
Yes, on June 25th, we published a statement from the Board of Directors. We had a conversation about it, and we agreed that the board would commission an independent study and review of our compensation to ensure that it is in line with standard practice and fair, certainly with regards to your comments. And that review has been commissioned and is underway, and we will share the recommendations of that review when they become available in the new year.
So you're going to compare your sector to businesses in general, or just broadcasters?
No, it'll be, well, what we do anyway on an annual basis, just so you understand. Our salaries at CBC Radio-Canada are benchmarked already with the guidance of compensation experts at 50% of what would be standard. So that means 50% of the range of a, let's say, an accounting executive or a manager, programming manager.
How much more time do I have, Chair?
You have 1 minute left.
Sorry, so just to be clear, what we're looking at is Crown corporations, because we operate as a Crown.
I need to get my last question. I'm so sorry to cut you off. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
You said something interesting. There is misinformation actually happening from Conservatives around viewership and actual ad revenue that's coming in. Your viewership, maybe on television, has dipped a bit, but your digital and other platforms have drastically increased, and your ad revenue overall, when you look at the big picture, has increased. Can you just give us a 30-second breakdown of where you are as an organization?
As I said, as Canadians shift from television, linear viewership, they have moved to digital. So a quick example, the National now reaches almost the same number of people on YouTube, on GEM, on connected TV as they do on traditional television.
Looking good overall for CBC when it comes to ad revenue and...
Well, I wouldn't overstate things are looking good, because television ad revenue is down. And what the entire industry is suffering from what I would call downward pressure because of what's going on in the industry.
Thank you so much.
Thank Mr. Coteau, thank you. And now I go to the Bloc Québécois for 6 minutes. Martin Champoux, Mr. Champoux, you have 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madame
Thank you, Ms. Tate and Mr. Goldblum. Ms. Tate, welcome. And which I do hope that for you is the last appearance before this committee during your term. I know it wasn't always easy for you. Nevertheless, you've always been frank and direct, and you've never hesitated to answer even the most difficult questions. The question regarding performance, premiums, or pay, I think has been covered a number of times. I think that this is a compensation model which needs to be reviewed. And as the minister intends to table a new bill for CBC Radio-Canada's mandate, I imagine that this will be part of the reflection that we've put in place. This said, however, as Mr. Cote said earlier, I am also a passionate believer in having a healthy public broadcaster. I think that it is very key to have this in the area of misinformation It is important that we have this in the media landscape. There are all different types of pseudo-journalistic companies that are coming into play, and I think it's terrible to see that we're seeing foreign interference as well, not only in political parties, but we're also seeing this foreign interference in information media and in social media, among others. So what I'd like to look at with you, Ms. Tate, is to call into question the criticism that has been leveled regarding the public broadcaster, CBC Radio Canada. We've already addressed this, and I do believe that we had put the numbers on the table during a previous visit, that appearance of yours before the committee. But I'd like to make some comparisons with other public broadcasters globally, because you raised these numbers. For instance, how much does this cost Canadians? How much do Canadians pay for CBC Radio Canada? How much does it cost Canadians to have a public broadcaster for you to adopt the necessary tools so that you can adapt to the markets? It's $32 per person per year. Let's compare this. Let's go to Australia. How expensive this is for Australians, $48. So I see you and I have the same numbers before us. We really like to compare ourselves to the Scandinavian countries in terms of their social networks, their values. We like to benchmark against Scandinavian countries. So what about Denmark? It costs $116 per person per year. Germany, it's $141.99 per year. In Norway, $150 per person. So isn't there an issue with respect to the perception that Canadians have? Of course. Well, yes, absolutely. And how do we go about countering this kind of perception? We are trying to explain this to Canadians, that Canada is a very vast country. We deliver services in English and in French, which is different from the case of Germany, and in 8 indigenous languages as well, with far more limited means. Now, the criticism that is leveled, and I'm not saying that isn't justified. I think the issue of the bonuses is important, and there's very negative perception about this. We agree on that. But I think the perception would be even more negative if executives, and let's say the anchors, etc., CBC Radio Canada, would be paid as much as we see in the private sector. So could you perhaps give us an example of what an equivalent salary would represent in the private sector? For example, a VP of information. I don't know if you have those numbers in that, but let's say Bell's CEO, which is a major company. So what is his annual compensation? So if we're speaking about the CEO of Bell, a BCE, that's around $13 million. So monomologue, that's Bell Media, it's around $5 million. So if I may say, this is exactly the kind of analysis that the report we have mandated will review. I don't even dare to speak about the public broadcast stars, and people have the sense that people on Radio Canada, CBC, earn millions. It's not that much. It's only in the private networks. For example, Quebecor channels where the stars make 4 or 5 times as much, and even on the radio. They follow the same model. But do you think that the public would prefer to see a boost in that compensation to improve the overall picture of the media landscape? Or do you believe that we should maintain this bonus model to show that the salaries are quite low and reasonable? After all, this is public money. I would say that even with the bonuses, that is, the total compensation of our executives, at 50%, even less, it's 50% and even less than what you're seeing in the private sector. And you're comparing that with executives from other countries where you have public broadcasters, as we mentioned earlier, without necessarily going to the more generous ones. But generally speaking, how do we compare to others? Well, you've mentioned Australia, the CEO of Australia, the public broadcaster, earns 1 million won, I believe. So in Canadian dollars. So we have a great deal to do regarding perception. There's a great work to do about the populist aspect of this as well. So you want to keep a healthy public broadcaster where there is no misinformation. Thank you very much.
And I now go to the New Democrats. Nikki Ashton, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. Ms. Tate, in an email obtained by the media through an access to information request, you wrote that the defund the CBC movement is gaining momentum, and it is true. Whether it's the Liberals whose threats of a 3% cut across the board led you to shrink your workforce to smaller than it was under Stephen Harper's years, or the Conservatives who've made it very clear they want to destroy the CBC. Canadians want to depend on the CBC. For us in the NDP, it is clear we need the CBC. We need a strong public broadcaster. However, not in the way that you're putting it forward. Under your leadership, executive bonuses are up while job cuts have been endemic. When asked about whether or not you regret the almost $20 million in executive bonuses this year while simultaneously cutting jobs, you said you don't, quote, live in regret, unquote, which I'm sure is cold comfort for the workers who lost their jobs and may no longer be able to live in actual homes. Will you acknowledge that your actions, CBC's actions to dole out $18 million in bonuses, has hurt CBC's reputation?
If I may, Madam Chair, there are a couple of points there I would like to correct. One is that executive bonuses or performance pay is up. The average is more or less the same as it has been in the last 10, 15 years. Let's be clear. The average across 1,000 employees is about $15,000. Number two, that the more jobs have been lost under my tenure. I would point out that over the last 6 years, 90 positions have been lost to the public broadcaster. Every job lost is very, very hard. Over the previous 10 years, 1,085 jobs were lost. So let us be clear, to paint a picture that CBC, Radio-Canada, is somehow cutting jobs in a heartless fashion. This is not true. During the pandemic, we were clear.
With all due respect, Ms. Tate, the question is about something that you have been on the record, certainly internally, as saying your concerns around the defund the CBC movement. Are you concerned that your actions, CBC's actions to dole out $18 million in bonuses, is contributing to the attacks on the CBC and, frankly, playing in the hands of Conservatives that want nothing less to do the CBC, to cut the CBC, while the rest of us believe we need a strong public broadcaster? Will you acknowledge that your actions are contributing to the attacks on the CBC?
I would say that the fact that my actions have contributed, as you're describing, is irrelevant. What would be more disturbing for Canadians is if the CBC's management and board of directors did not act in a way that was independent and fiscally responsible. We had commitments to over 1,000 employees, and we met those commitments. We heard the concerns, and we have taken action and ordered a third-party review of our compensation policies. Beyond that, I cannot see how else we could respond without having, quite frankly, cause Canadians to be concerned about the true independence of their public broadcaster.
Ms. Tate, when we talk about the role of a public broadcaster, we need to talk about its mandate. You're not Bell Media, which we had in front of this committee and who made it very clear that they were putting profit ahead of local journalism. CBC has an obligation to ensure that regions across our country, including Northern Canada, have the voices it deserves. No better example of the damage that's been caused is the deeply cynical treatment of the CBC position here in Northern Manitoba. Last time you came to our committee, you mentioned how pleased you were that the CBC had filled the position. What was not known to us was that it had been filled for 2 months as a secondment. We no longer have anybody here after years of not having anybody here. CBC's mandate is to ensure that somebody services CBC North Country. This means that 85,000 people across Manitoba no longer have a voice through the CBC and haven't had one for years. I contrast that with the leadership of Hubert Lacroix, the previous president, with whom I worked. He listened to our communities. He listened to people saying that we needed a CBC voice and made sure that our station stayed open. Under your leadership, we've seen the opposite, and a cynical play in last committee meeting to say that you filled the position when in fact it was only for a couple of months. So my question is, what were the bonuses for? Where is the commitment to regional broadcasting when regions like ours are back to being a media desert when it comes to the CBC? What are the bonuses for exactly when you're not fulfilling the mandate that the CBC has in terms of regional broadcasting? And why should Canadians believe that the CBC matters when you consistently leave regions like ours in the dark?
I'm not sure what the question is, Madam Chair.
35 seconds.
Well, the question is, what were the bonuses for if you're failing when it comes to regional broadcasting?
5,000 hours of local news audio were delivered this past year. That's with 7,000 hours per day of video and audio distributed across this country. 450 news articles are published daily. 50% of those come from locations like Thompson, Manitoba. Yes, we filled the position, and the person made up the personal decision to move back to live with her partner. That job is up for hire again. It is very difficult for us to find people in those regions, but we're working hard on it. I'll remind you that during my tenure, we added journalists in Lethbridge, in Cranbrook, in Nanaimo, and in Kingston, Ontario. We have limited resources. We know that for CBC,
Please wrap up your answer,
Thank
Mrs.
you, Ms. Tate.
We're
Your
over time
CBC
here.
is clearly not trying hard enough. Thank you.
Good. We go to the second round. And the second round is a 5-minute round. And we begin with Monsieur Gourde for the Conservative Party. 5 minutes, please, Monsieur Gourde.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci, Madame Tate, Madame Goblin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Tate, Mr. Goodman, Ms. Tate, I'm very pleased to see you here in person. And in fact, you were there in person for the opening of the Olympic Games. I just want to know whether this was during your personal vacation. Yes. Well, the media has indicated that you charged the Canadian taxpayers $1,000 per night for the hotel, as well as other expenses in the order of approximately $6,000. So why charge $6,000 to Canadians if you were there during your personal holiday? I was in France for my personal holiday during the Olympic Games, but during those days I was working for CBC Radio Canada. And if you were to look at all of the newspapers, it was very clear there was no hotel room in Paris that was available at a lower price than that. So this was the official hotel for the Games. I was there with other delegates, and I benefited from all of the services. For example, the shuttle that enabled us to go to the opening of the Games because there were security issues at stake. I understand, but you just indicated that you were on a personal holiday, but then you were no longer on a personal holiday. It's important to have the true version. Well, I was on holiday. That's why I did not ask CBC Radio Canada to pay for my airfare. Nevertheless, when I went to the Games, I was working on behalf of Radio Canada, of course, CBC. So you cut part of your personal holidays there because you were there 2-3 weeks a month. It doesn't matter, but you cut those in half and you charge those prices. I'd like to come back to the bonuses. So the managers at Radio Canada, CBC, those who receive bonuses, have any of them threatened to leave if they did not receive the bonuses? because the bonuses were taken from a very tight budget. After all, there have been cutbacks, as you've indicated. They had to cut back on production. People lost their jobs. Some jobs were not filled. But these managers were aware that they hurt many people, especially young people who lost their jobs. Are there any among these managers who would have simply agreed to not receive the bonus this year to perhaps allow other employees to retain their jobs? Or did people say, well, if we don't obtain our bonuses, we'll work elsewhere? Well, I can't speak to the actions of other persons. What I can say is that we asked our legal department to review the risks linked to measures that would eliminate the bonuses. And then we understood that, as Mr. Couteau has just indicated, it was an obligation that we had vis-à-vis these some 1,000 employees. But between us and the Canadian public, some might have said, look, we are in a year where we must cut back. We have to be careful with taxpayers' money. CBC Radio Canada had a budget issue, and I believe that all of the managers who were entitled to bonus would have agreed if leadership had told them, look, this year we're not giving you a bonus to save as many jobs as possible, to do as much creative work as possible. No doubt this would have been agreed to by most of the managers. Was there really a group of people absolutely wanted to obtain these bonuses, or was this a decision made by senior management to hand out the bonuses? Well, I have to say that cutting bonuses, as you said, or rather this is the performance pay, does not solve the problem we face regarding the structural deficit at CBC Radio Canada. It doesn't save any jobs because the following year we will be facing the same pressure. So in my mind, it was far more important, and as I've discussed this very carefully with the board of directors, to maintain and to honor our obligations vis-à-vis these employees so that we retain the talent, given all of the difficult years that are coming up. So does this money for the bonuses come from any cutbacks or additional funds? Because know that in subsequent years there were $40 million additional dollars that were given to Radio Canada. Does this come from government, or does this come from the cutbacks? That was due to the restructuring of the organization. We have a great deal of work to do with respect to managing a budget. It is a $1.8 billion budget. This involves many components. Every year, we earmark or we reserve the possibility of having this compensation pay because these are obligations.
Mr. Gould, your time is up, I'm afraid. And now I go to the Liberals for the second round. Mr. Nur Mohammed for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madame Tate and Mr. Goldman for being with us today. Madame Tate, can you talk to us about what the CBC performance pay model was in 2014 versus what it is today in terms of its structure and how it's organized? Or is there any difference?
Just let me have a look here for my file. You say specifically in 2014. In 2014, the number of people receiving the performance pay was only 544 as opposed to 1,180. There was a decision taken before my arrival to expand the number of people receiving performance pay because we were having difficulty retaining certain pay bands within the organization. You need to understand that when I say we are paid at 50% what the industry pays, that means we have retention challenges. And therefore, the performance pay was put in place to a larger group of people in order to ensure retention. And
right.
for the
my question, Madam Tate, my question, I mean, I buy that. My question is really more: have you changed the formula of what performance pay looks like versus what it was in 2014, Is it a completely new system, or is it the same thing that was in place?
It's the same system. We have simplified it. We've tried to make fewer performance indicators to make it clearer for employees what they're driving towards, but it is basically the same approach, not just since 2014, since 2007.
Since 2007. And in terms of the I don't know if you can tell me this, but on an inflation-adjusted basis, are the bonuses now materially more than they would have been paid out on the Harper era on a per capita basis, or are they about the same or less?
No, as I said, on an inflationary basis, they would be less. But as I said earlier, they have stayed at about $15,000 average per recipient of performance pay.
So just to clarify, on an inflation-adjusted basis, under the Harper government, under conservatives, CBC bonuses or CBC performance pay was on a per capita basis more than it is today.
Yes, I mean, I haven't got the math on inflation, but yes, they would be marginally higher, yes.
Right, I see, okay. Can you tell me whether or not the Conservative Party of Canada has been spending money on advertising on CBC?
I beg your pardon? I didn't hear the question.
Do you know if the Conservative Party has been buying advertising on CBC?
No, I'm not entirely sure of that, but they certainly can. I believe any political party may buy advertising outside of an election period, is my understanding of the policy.
Let me help you with that. I believe they have been buying advertising on CBC. And I guess I'm wondering, can you help me square the circle? We hear a lot from Conservatives about defunding the CBC, about it not being of any value to Canadians, and yet they'd be buying advertising on your platform. Can you help me understand, because I'm having some difficulty with this, why would you be criticizing a platform? Why would you criticize a broadcaster and then go and spend money on it and buy advertising on it?
Well, I would assume it's because we're a very effective way of reaching more Canadians.
It would seem that way. Can you tell me about the reach that you actually have now across all of your platforms relative to what you might have had in 2014?
Oh, we have become the #1 news platform in digital in the country. We reach 21 million Canadians every month in English and in French.
So you reach 21 million Canadians in English and in French. Can Canadians access news can Canadians access your content free? Is that a yes? Sorry, I didn't hear you, Madam Chair.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Our news is free.
So your news is free, and it is available to all Canadians across the country from coast to coast to coast.
Coast to coast to coast.
Right. And what would be the impact if if Conservatives were given the opportunity to defund the CBC and Radio-Canada? What would that do to access for news and content for Canadians in rural communities, in Quebec, and I would argue in Indigenous communities? Could you give us a sense of what that would look like if all of that was cut?
It would be devastating. We are the only national media service in the country. It would pose questions of national security. We operate 720 transmission towers across 520 sites, the largest network in the country. To defund CBC, if it was only CBC, would be laying off 3,500 employees. It would mean no local news. CBC and Radio-Canada are co-located in 15 stations across the country. That would mean that those services, especially to French language minority communities, would be highly compromised. And
Can you wrap up, please, Ms. Tate? I'm sorry, we've gone over time.
And let's talk about the North and our role in preserving Indigenous languages.
Thank you. I now go to Monsieur Champoux for 2.5 minutes, please, Martin.
Continuons là-dessus, Madame Tate, si vous le voulez bien, parce que
Let's
je trouve que
continue on
c'est
that vein, Ms. Tate, because I think this is an extremely important point as part of all of this disinformation campaign that is being launched by the tenants of defunding the CBC. They are telling Francophones outside of Quebec and Quebecers that Radio-Canada would be saved and French language services would not be affected by their measures. Are you telling us that is absolutely possible to consider that CBC could be defunded without there being an impact on French language services? 100%. So you're confirming it, as other experts have confirmed that we have consulted and to whom we've put this question. that both are tied together. Yes, these services are integrated, not on the editorial level, as I indicated the time before, but on a technology place in terms of the locations, the experts. We work together. Ms. Tate, there's a great deal of concern regarding misinformation and information often being put forward by foreign agents in countries like Russia and China, who we suspect of having interfered with some political parties, but also in the media landscape, as I mentioned in my earlier comments. Some countries, however, are absolutely resistant to disinformation, like Finland. As you know, the Russians don't even attempt to try to put in place disinformation in Finland because Finland, the public there has been made aware of this from an early age. It is part of the school system. That is, citizens are aware of these dangers from the very moment as soon as they're able to think through these issues, and they have a critical thinking ability. Do you believe that the public broadcaster has a role to play in educating the public on disinformation? Absolutely. We also know that education is the jurisdiction of the provinces, but at the same time, that is exactly the work that we conduct with our, for example, our youth and children's youth news service on the CBC side. And I don't want to generalize, nor do I want to point a finger at any media outlet, but given the arrival of new information sources that are often questionable, some are actually openly partisan or politically committed to a specific party, have you noticed in media that we call the traditional media who provide information services that there's a tendency to align on more editorialistic but less rigorous journalistic positions? Have you noted this? And is this something that worries you? That is exactly why I believe that we need a strong public and public broadcast that is well funded, because we have the highest journalistic practices in Canada.
Thank you very much. I'm giving leeway here to get answers and questions through. So just remember that, but try not to go so much over time, guys. Thank you. NDP. Nikki, for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I first just want to start with a comment, Ms. Tate. You referred to some personal details with respect to the reporter that was here in northern Manitoba. I find that unacceptable and frankly irrelevant. The bottom line here is that CBC has failed to fill the position in any sort of full-time, long-term situation, and I don't think relying on personal details of the reporter that was here is fair game or acceptable, and frankly unprofessional coming from the CEO of a corporation as well. I do hope that the CBC actually does its job and fills the position long-term as its mandate requires it to do. Moving on, True North, a conspiratorial website that has denied the genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada and has peddled all sorts of conspiracy theories, has done interviews with the leader of a banned white supremacist group and also sat down with a number of Conservative MPs, including the leader of the Conservatives, Mr. Poilievre. In one such interview, Mr. Poilievre argued to defund the CBC, which is no surprise. He's talked about this many times. He's even just quoted as saying, quote, "I can't wait to defund the CBC." Unquote. This is unacceptable, and it is heartbreaking for so many Canadians that rely on a strong public broadcaster. This is core to who we are as Canadians, who we are as a country. It is particularly important in regions like ours, and I would argue in every single region across the country. However, when we see $18 million worth of bonuses, or as you call it, performance pay, we know that this contributes to the negative reputation that the CBC has, particularly at a time when so many Canadians are struggling. Do you agree that the next head of the CBC should save jobs by ending outrageous executive bonuses?
I believe that the Board of Directors has taken the appropriate action, and based on the results of that report, we'll share with my successor, and they will plan accordingly.
You have 20 seconds, Ms. Ashton.
Yeah, well, I'll certainly comment by saying, we know from access to information that you're on the record as being concerned about the defund the CBC movement. We've also heard, of course, that you don't live in regret given the bonuses that you and other executives have received. What I find deeply concerning is the inability to connect the doling out of these bonuses and the real criticism that a lot of Canadians have of the CBC doing that. That's not the role of a public broadcaster. It's not the role of a crown corporation. We know here in regions like ours, you're not fulfilling your mandate in terms of broadcasting. What are these bonuses for?
Thank you, Ms. Ashton. Thank you. And actually, we're still in the second round. I go to Mr. Giovanni for the Conservatives. 5 minutes, please, Mr. Giovanni.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Tate, I just want to clarify a couple of things that I heard today. So first, did you say that you were on a personal trip to France, decided to extend your vacation, go to the Olympics, and then bill the taxpayer for it? Is that correct?
I was on a personal trip to France, and I did not bill the taxpayer for my flight or travel from Canada.
What did you bill the taxpayer for?
The hotel and the train to get to Paris.
Where does your personal trip end and your taxpayer billing begin?
When as part of my job, being at the opening of the Olympics was absolutely expected of me, so I interrupted my holiday and took the 4 days to go to the Olympics.
Could you understand why that sounds concerning to somebody? Just because, bit of a weird situation where you get to go on a trip, you're having your personal time, and then you just unilaterally get to decide what becomes work and what doesn't?
Well, not if I'm not charging the company for the trip.
But you did charge the taxpayer $6,000.
Correct.
For your
when
time
I was
in Paris.
Working in Paris, I did, yes.
But could you understand why it would be concerning?
I would think that it would be concerning
that
it would be concerning if the CEO of CBC Radio-Canada did not attend the opening of the Olympics, given it was one of the most important events of our calendar year.
But when the average Canadian hears that you're charging thousands of dollars to the taxpayer, and you are just kind of deciding when your personal time ends and your billable time begins, it gets to sort of a broader concern, and to the point about bonuses that many of our colleagues have made today, of whether you have respect for the taxpayer. Can you see why that would be concerning to the average Canadian?
I do not make those decisions alone. I always check in with my chair, and I behave in a responsible fashion.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to ask if you agree with a statement that's been attributed to you. And I'm going to quote, "The defund narrative has picked up momentum, especially as it relates to CBC television." Did that come from you?
Yes.
Okay. So that was reported last week by the National Post from an email they obtained from you, and I believe in January 2024. Is that correct?
I presume so, yes.
Okay. So when you look at the concerns over your expenses, right, which I think legitimate concerns over where your personal vacation time ends and where your billable time begins, when you see the concerns over news stories related to your bonuses that are going out and bonuses you may receive or executives receive, the $18 million that we've been talking about today, do you think any of that might contribute to what you yourself have observed as a growing movement to defund the CBC?
I absolutely do not.
Why is that?
Because I believe that having experienced now the third appearance at this committee, I would say that there is a clear effort on the part of members of this committee to vilify and to discredit me and to discredit the organization. Not one question has been asked, not one question has been asked about the accomplishments of the public broadcaster over the last 6 years and how we have served
I think
Canadians.
our Liberal colleagues have asked you some of those questions, so I think that's not a fair representation of your time here today. But let's go back to something that our colleague, Mr. Coteau, asked you earlier. You referred to KPIs, key performance indicators. Would the idea that a growing movement in our country would like to defund your organization be weighed into an analysis of key performance indicators and determining whether the discretionary portions of the bonuses that you've acknowledged there is a percentage that is discretionary and not contractually obligated, that those percentages that you might consider, if people don't like what we're doing, if people don't trust us, if people would like the government to take money away from our bloated organization, maybe we shouldn't be spending more of their money than we have to. Could that not cross your mind in analyzing the KPIs?
We do not take into consideration political wins or influences in determining our business metrics.
So you would call it a political reaction for the average Canadian to hear that you're doling out $18 million in bonuses, that you're billing the taxpayer for your time in Paris while on a personal vacation. That's a political concern that the average Canadian wouldn't have a pure interest in that based purely on the fact that they are giving you their hard-earned money through taxes?
I'm not sure I understand what
30
you're
seconds.
getting at on this question. I'm
30
sorry.
seconds, please.
You're trying to marginalize legitimate concerns about abuse of taxpayer dollars and any accountability that we are trying as parliamentarians to introduce here, and you're saying it's purely political. And what I'm saying is the big, beautiful, growing movement to defund the CBC is not a purely political movement, but it is a matter of taxpayer accountability. Can you not acknowledge that?
I will not, Madam Chair, I will not be accused of abusing taxpayer dollars. I'm sorry, for the record. We have managed our budget extremely carefully. We were facing
I don't think the Canadian
$100
people would
million.
agree with you. I don't think the Canadian people would agree with you.
Giovanni, will you allow Ms. Tate to finish her answer? Thank you.
We were facing a $125 million deficit. We managed as carefully as we could, and we respected the obligations we had to over 1,180 employees. I believe Canadians will understand. And by the way, 73% of Canadians still consider us the most trusted source of news. 79% of Canadians say they believe that CBC should be in the future of this country.
Is that reported on by the CBC?
I think
those facts, those
gone
data?
over time, Mr. Giovanni. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm now going to go to the Liberals. Ms. Dillon, for 5 minutes, please.
Point of order, can I ask a quick question? Is there an intermission in between, or are we going 2 hours straight? Is it just a 2 hours straight?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'd like to start with maybe the accomplishments of the CBC, such as the Paralympics Games. 11 million Canadians viewed these. Then we also have the North American Indigenous Games, the Arctic Winter Games, the promotion of musicians who are struggling, Canadian musicians. What would happen to all of these people if it's very easy to say CBC were defunded? How would private media interests affect Canadians, the consumption of information they get, the promotion of Canadian values, heritage, culture? What would happen to all of these things if the CBC were defunded? Please, if you can.
So just on the sports side of the equation of what you've asked, CBC Radio-Canada has made a commitment to gender parity in amateur sports coverage. That means we've gone from 4% of women covered in sport to 50%. And in para-sports, we've made an enormous commitment to coverage on a year-round basis. The IOC considers CBC Radio-Canada in the top 5 Olympic broadcasters in the world because of our year-round commitment to amateur sports. And just to be clear, if not for CBC Radio-Canada, and we heard this from the Canadian Olympic Committee, the Paralympic Committee last week at a conference where they stated without prompting from us that without CBC Radio-Canada, there would be no support for our amateur athletes in this country. So it is profound. Similarly, on the music side, without the Junos, without La Disque, without all of the things that we do for emerging talent, music, writing, performing, we would be impoverishing this country.
And how do we protect, as I said, Canadian values and culture, as opposed to private media organizations who are going to look at their own private media interests? At least globally, CBC is still promoting Canada and Canadians?
I can't comment on what motivates private companies, though, with respect to the values of the country. But I would say that CBC, Radio-Canada, with its programming like L'Akainu, like Pour Toi Flora, like Bones of Crows, like Son of a Critch, like Allegiance, these are shows that represent Canada's values, Canada's talent, and that are widely distributed on the world stage and speak enormously about our values of tolerance, our values of truth. And I do believe that without CBC, it would be a huge impoverishment of our status and our place on the world stage.
And Radio-Canada is so important because it keeps Francophones connected across Canada as well. And can you talk to us a little bit about the importance of protecting Radio-Canada we talk about CBC all the time, but I would mention Radio-Canada.
Well, I said it earlier, and I think Deputy Member Martin Champoux said that without Radio-Canada in the minority language communities, I'm talking Francophones in Edmonton and North Bay, all over the country, there would be no French news service available to them. And I tried to mention that our role in the North, Nathan Obed, president of ITK at the conference last week here in Ottawa, said unequivocally there would be no Inuktitut in this country if not for CBC. CBC has been in the North since 1958, broadcasting in Inuktitut. Without the CBC, that language would have disappeared. These are the kinds of things that CBC does for this country, and I can only say that it would be, as I have been quoted, it would be a tragedy to lose them.
And can you... 30 seconds? Okay. Would you like to say anything about the Paris part of your trip and anything to clarify on that?
Well, I would just say that it's the role of the CEO to represent CBC Radio-Canada. We had 185 employees there, many of them in a back office in Roissy, which is near the airport, where I spent time with them. They never even go downtown, doing the technical, very incredibly advanced work that we do to produce the games, a lot of which is done remotely, by the way, and also to meet with the Canadian Olympic Committee and all of the associated IOC executives. Let us be clear. We have negotiated the broadcast rights and digital rights to the Olympics through Brisbane 2032. And that gives us a 10-year runway to support amateur sports and athletes in this country, an invaluable treasure, I believe, to this country.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Tate. I now go to a third round. 5 minutes again, starting with Kevin Waugh from the Conservative Party. 5 minutes, please, Kevin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome again, Ms. Tate, along with Mr. Goldbloom. I noticed in your opening statement, because today we invited the senior management and compensation at CBC Radio and CBC Television. So your opening statement didn't talk about the compensation. You talked about how accurate your news bureaus are, the trust that people have in you, you're based on facts, but you never talked about the $18.4 million in bonuses. So let me start there again, if you don't mind, Ms. Tate. For 2022-23 bonuses, have you received your compensation package for 22-23?
Are you talking about me personally?
I'm talking about you personally.
So just to be clear for the record, the CEO of CBC Radio-Canada does not participate in the payment plan that 1,180 people participate in.
So you haven't got it yet.
The process is different. It goes from a recommendation from the board to the minister, and from the minister to PCO. And to date, I have not heard back on that particular.
On that year. How about this year, 23-24?
Same thing.
Okay, so here's what I'm thinking. Those bonuses are going to be tied into your exit package in January when you leave. So I think it just seems natural to me. Your fiscal year end is March. You haven't received your package. I suspect the previous 5 years you got a bonus performance package. You haven't received one for 22-23, 23-24, and probably 25 up to January when you leave. So my worry is we're not going to be able to scrutinize this because you're going to leave. Mr. Goldblum and as board chair, they're going to recommend a bonus package up 2.5 years. And we won't get a shot at you coming back here in 25 to talk about it. And that's why Canadians are upset about the bonus package. And let me give you a few examples, because I did a survey of my own, and I know it's not Toronto, it may not be Vancouver, it may not be Montreal, but here's what my constituents, when I sent out, 1.4 billion a year and bonuses of 18.4 million, that's insanity. That came from Elaine. This is from Carol. I refuse to listen or watch CBC News anymore. You know the metrics in Saskatchewan. Nobody watches or listens to CBC. Here's from Dawn. Totally unfair to taxpayers and hungry folks in our country. From Trevor, nobody I know watches or trusts CBC anymore. From Rita, waste of taxpayers' money to fund bonuses on the executives. Should be a complete overhaul from the CEO and management. That came from Rose. Joanne, CBC has been a huge waste of taxpayers' money. To fund this as soon as possible. From Dan, as a lifelong listener, CBC has lost its ways. So we had hundreds of responses from little old Saskatoon. 80%, 86% major changes to the corporation or to fund them entirely. 86% out of Saskatoon. What do you say about those numbers?
I say I travel this country from north to west to east, and I also have hundreds, if not thousands, of positive remarks back on how important CBC Radio-Canada is in those communities that I have visited. In the north, in Yellowknife, in Whitehorse.
How about Saskatchewan?
And by the way, in Saskatoon,
Have you ever visited Saskatoon, Regina?
I have,
for you.
Both Saskatoon. I went to the Yorkton Festival.
Just 1 minute.
Okay, so-
Some order, please. A question was asked of the witness. Can she finish answering it, and then you can go with the other question.
Okay.
Thank you.
I would just point to, because there is a large Indigenous community in Saskatchewan, and we spend a lot of time engaging with those communities in the development of our Indigenous strategy. And I would say, across the board, I have heard only, quite frankly, a willingness to work with CBC and with Radio-Canada to change the narrative about Indigenous people in this country, something that this organization is 100% committed to.
I've got
30 seconds,
30
Kevin.
seconds left. So from your strategy, public affairs, and government relations person, on average, each visitor spends 37 minutes a month on your platforms. 37 minutes a month. Ms. Tate, that is two at-issues. 37 minutes is nothing. You talk about 21 million each month are hitting your platforms. The number that stood out to me, they're on there for 37 minutes a month. It's deplorable. You're not reaching out to Canadians. 37 minutes a month. Think about that.
Thank you, Mr. Waugh. Thank you, Mr. Waugh. I now go to Ms. Gainey for the Liberals. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and hello to both of our witnesses. Thank you for being with us today. I'm just wondering if you could go back a little bit to this, the notion around defunding the CBC. I mean, I think on this side of the committee room, we're in firm agreement of the value of the narrative building, of the exposure of our athletes, our arts and culture. There's tremendous value in the CBC, and there'd be two things to this question. One, I'm curious if you could perhaps reoffer us those per capita costs of what we're spending here in Canada compared to other countries. I believe my colleague, Mr. Champoux, had started down that, but I think that would be interesting, again, just to set the conversation around just how much value we're getting given really what the cost and what we're investing in the CBC is. It strikes me as quite impressive. And by extension, when we hear from, for example, the challenge of hiring in rural parts of the country, as my other colleague has addressed, when you hear about in your workplace and in the CBC community this defund narrative, tweets, in front of the headquarters in Toronto, diminishing and reducing, in a sense, the value and fueling that discussion around defunding the CBC. How does that impact your ability to recruit the talent that you need? So both from your resource perspective, but also from a morale perspective. What is the impact of this line of thinking that's being advanced around the CBC?
Thank you for the question. The first one was I had articulated earlier that the cost to Canadians is $32 per person per year. And for that, CBC Radio-Canada provides, as I've said before, services on linear television and radio, over 45,000 hours of original video content, 7,000 hours a day distributed across the country, 95,000 hours of audio, and the list goes on. What I would say is that $32 has not budged. We used to just deliver television and radio, and we're now doing all the other things on digital platforms, on streaming, audio, and video. So we've expanded the services without increasing the budget. With respect to morale, I can tell you that it is not easy, especially for our employees at CBC, though I would say our colleagues at Radio-Canada are equally nervous. But at CBC, it is highly demoralizing to be the target of constant criticism when you're working each and every day to bring Canadians fact-based news and information across this country and to be commissioning some of the best programming in the world. So it is hard to attract people when the organization is so uncertain, when the future of the organization is so uncertain. And I would just say that the sooner that this narrative is either shut down, the better, because it is really, really damaging the reputation of the organization, certainly more than performance pay.
Thank you for that. I believe I'm sharing my time with my colleague, Patricia. Happy to turn the floor over to her.
But that's news to me.
Oh.
I thought Ms. Satanzio was, I have on my name here, she's up in the next round. Ms. Gainey, so
well, I apologize,
unless
I
that's
misunderstood.
Changed, you have 2 minutes.
I will wrap it up then, that's fine. Thank you.
Do?
Madam Chair, can I use the 2 minutes that are left?
Would you like the 2 minutes?
Sure.
Yes, go ahead. That's why I called your name.
Okay,
thank you.
Sorry. Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Tate. Welcome again, and welcome to Mr. Goldbloom. My questions will be addressed to you, Mr. Goldbloom, and with regards to the financial situation. We understand that it's the same as what other broadcasters are facing, and or how is it different or unique to CBC Radio-Canada?
I was fortunate to participate in a conference held here in Ottawa just 2 weeks ago of the major public service media from around the world. I think there were 30 or 40 different organizations represented, and the message from everyone was the same, that the importance of public service media in the democratic world is in fact, more important than it's ever been, particularly around the question of disinformation. So there was a lot of discussion about how our public service media can help in the process of informing our citizens. Our democracies are predicated on our citizens being informed, and the challenge to disinformation is greater than it's ever been. That's what I mentioned in my opening remarks, the concern that Canadians will not be able to know what's true. So it's a similar situation. The funding also, I mean, we are all facing the same challenges, private and public media, from the large global tech companies Meta, Google, Amazon, what have you. So it's a significant challenge for all public service media around the world to continue to provide the service to their citizens, and that's certainly the case for us here in Canada.
Okay. And, you know, you say that more than 20 million Canadians are using the digital services, or at least that was Ms. Tate's testimony earlier. So why is it that the digital revenue is not seeming to make up for the decline in the television revenue?
I'll start. I'll start, then I'll hand it.
30 seconds.
Just very quickly, that's the reality for all media, that that digital advertising is much less profitable than the advertising that supported traditional media.
Thank you very much. And now, Martin Champoux, 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci. Madame Tate, on parle beaucoup de
Ms. Tate, we've spoken extensively about the survival and the sustainability of the public broadcaster. That is specifically what we've addressed today. A report was delivered to the Quebec government by Ms. Amélie Binet and Ms. Binet, a former executive from Radio-Canada. Are you aware of this report? I have not read it, but I do know more or less what the content is. So you know that there are a number of recommendations in this Quebec with respect to Quebec, and they want to be involved. So what do you think about the recommendations that were tabled? I think if we're speaking about governance, of CBC governance, CBC Radio-Canada, that is part of the federal government's responsibilities. So it does not behoove us to speak to it. The report emphasizes how important it is to have French language services delivered by CBC Radio-Canada across the country, but specifically in Quebec, to assure the survival of French in Quebec and Quebec society. Radio-Canada is greatly appreciated in Quebec. It is original content that is developed by Radio-Canada for Quebec viewership is greatly appreciated overall. Would you agree in saying that when the government of Quebec, based on these recommendations, is saying that a number of security measures should be put in place in the new mandate? That is, for example, to amend legislation to ensure that systematically there will be a vice president for French language services and English language services. It's not in the law currently, it's a practice. Would you agree with this? Would you also agree with the fact that, for instance, it is a requirement that people speak both official languages, that is both the CEOs, but as well as the chair of the board. Currently it is a practice, but it has not yet been enshrined in legislation. Do you believe that it would be easy to implement these measures, and would they be efficient? I believe that the protections we have in place for French under the Public Broadcasting Act is there, but we also have protection under the Official Languages Act, and I think these are sufficient to provide that kind of protection. Well, I'm afraid to interrupt you. I have very little time. Well, this is our fear. For example, another government would come into place and could literally cut back on this. And as a result, the French language services delivered by Radio-Canada will be cut, would be undermined, as we like to say. I understand this fear, but I believe that the Official Languages Act that has been amended and that adds additional protection for Radio-Canada, I think is sufficient for the time being, but I leave that in the hands of the federal government to review if required.
Thank you. Ms. Tate, in your conversations with the Liberal Minister of Heritage or other representatives from this government, was there ever a discussion where they suggested you not hand out and that the CBC not hand out millions of dollars in executive bonuses while eliminating jobs?
No, we do not discuss internal administration issues with the government.
I want to move on to another issue. A 2021 open letter made clear the problem Canadian journalists face when covering Palestine. Quote, anyone who has worked in a Canadian newsroom has encountered the reluctance or resistance to covering Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Canadian style guides still ban the use of the word Palestine in coverage. This has led to many corrections over the years. Racialized journalists have reported feeling overly scrutinized or even censored after every story pitch on this region. End quote. I also indicate that I recently worked with groups like Independent Jewish Voices to call on Canada's Revenue Agency to end the practice of Canadian charities illegally funding settlements or facilitating war crimes in Palestine. The CBC and other outlets did not cover this. Following the release of the letter I quoted from, 2 CBC journalists were told they could no longer report on Palestine. And this has been repeated time and time again. In fact, last week, a journalist, Arfa Rana, wrote about her experience being the only Muslim in her newsroom trying to provide context to CBC's coverage of Palestine-Israel. After raising the concerns she had, she was punished by her editors by being dismissed from daily pitch meetings for a few weeks. A senior producer told her that Palestine was a, quote, outdated term, end quote, like Persia. She makes no mention of that senior producer receiving any sort of punishment. Who knows? Maybe he even received a bonus. She wrote, quote, when crimes against humanity are being committed, there is no such thing as both sides to a story. There is only the truth. Her treatment by CBC executives led to her resigning her position. The CBC is worse off as a result. And I want to indicate that when we're talking about a crisis of reputation, we're also talking about CBC's coverage of what's happening in Palestine right now, something that we've heard a number of people be critical of. I know that the editorial line needs to be separate from your side of things, but what can the next president of the CBC do to ensure that journalists aren't being silenced, stifled, or that both siding a genocide isn't happening from our public broadcaster?
Thank you, but we now have run out of time, but I will allow the state 30 seconds to answer, please.
Well, I'm afraid it's not a 30-second answer. This is one of the most difficult and emotional subjects that we have faced in our newsrooms, both at Radio-Canada and CBC, since October 7th, the most tragic events of the Middle East. And all I can say is that we work very, very hard to support all of our journalists, irrespective of their backgrounds. And most importantly, we have journalistic standards and practices that are transparent, that we respect, and that we have 2 ombudsmen to ensure that they are respected in all of our news coverage. So all I could say on that point is that I have great confidence that my successor will do as I have done, which is to leave the business of news reporting in the hands of the experts and the professionals who are of the highest standard in this country, and quite frankly, some of the best from around the world.
Thank you. I now go to the final part of this round, and it's for the Conservatives, Mr. Kurek. For 5 minutes, please, Mr. Kurek.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. You talked a lot about trust and relying on the facts, and it is a fact that there were significant job cuts at CBC. In fact, cuts that were made just before Christmas. It is a fact that performance pay bonuses were awarded very generously to the tune of more than $18 million. And to reconcile that with your testimony here today is quite something. So we did do some digging into these KPIs, the key performance indicators, and some of the targets. And you talked in your previous testimony before this committee a lot about a process. But what I find very interesting is that it's only the reports that come out of the CBC and where they fan over how great you're doing. To the tune of maybe the only place that you'd be more popular than that is at a Liberal cabinet meeting. But even today, you suggested that we shouldn't, to one of Mr. Cotto's questions, you said that you needed to be realistic in that. So these KPIs, this year, or this past fiscal year, you said your own metrics say you met 13 of the 14 performance targets, a massive increase from only meeting 3 of the 14 targets the previous year. Something doesn't smell right with that. When it comes to the actual meeting targets tangible, we started going through some of that information, and you lowered the KPIs for this past year, some of them quite significantly. Now, Ms. Tate, compared to the previous year, 3 of 14 versus 13 of 14, does that affect bonuses?
Sorry, the years you're referring to? 22, 23, and 23, 24, not 14, correct?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
What was the question?
So in 2022, 2023, you met 3 of 14 KPIs. This last year, you met 13 of 14. Did that affect the bonuses paid out?
Of course it did.
Yet, by your own information, you lowered those KPIs in order to see that they were met. So in other words, what you have stated is that by lowering the KPIs, your organization and those within management are receiving more information.
Could I respond to that?
I'd like to ask, well, I'm just stating the facts, Ms. Tate. Mr. Goldblum, I'm wondering if you could share with this committee.
Excuse me, please.
Point of order.
Yes, Mr.
I really do think if you're making such a grand statement, I think the witness should be able to respond to it. That's just fair.
Thank you, Mr. Couture. To make that, one cannot make a statement without allowing the witness a chance to respond. So, Ms. Tate, please.
We have a very rigorous process in place for establishing KPIs on an annual basis. We look at previous performance, but most importantly, we look at what's happening in the industry. When you see a trend of 5% decline on television subscription, you don't ignore it. You adjust your KPIs accordingly, and we build in stretch. So what that means is every single KPI is looked at, and by the way, they are not all lowered. They are, in the case of kids, in the case of diversity and representation, there are a number that are higher than the previous year. But just to be clear, we're not making up KPIs. They are based on what is going on in the industry. And I think you've heard on a number of occasions from others that this industry is in decline. It is an extremely challenging time. So how do you manage that, and how do you keep your people motivated to go forward? You build in stretch.
That stretch is a new word, and certainly there seems to be some stretching taking place here. Mr. Goldblum, can you commit to release to this committee the information related to recommendations that you have made for Ms. Tate's bonus and recommendations that you would make to the government when it comes to severance?
As I said before, our communications with the government around the performance recommendations of the CEO, my understanding is that's governed by privacy. So
okay, thank you. I do have one last question.
But I do want to say we will make public the report done by the independent organization that's going to look at our compensation, and we'd be pleased to share those recommendations with you.
Thank you. Please do. Ms. Tate, the CBC stopped broadcasting the Calgary Stampede a number of years ago. Why?
I wasn't at the organization at that time, so I can't comment on the specifics of that decision.
Is Western heritage and frontier culture important to the CBC?
Absolutely, it is. Absolutely, it is. It's why we're rolling out more journalist positions in the West disproportionately to anywhere else in the country.
So I want to nail down specifically. Could you provide information related to the specifics around the Calgary Stampede to this committee, please?
Thank you.
I'm happy to.
Thank you. I now go to Mr. Tanzio for 5 minutes, please.
Hello. Madam Chair, can you hear me?
Hear you? I can hear you. Can everyone hear her? That's good. Thanks.
All right. So one of the first meetings that the Harper government did when it got into office was to boost the performance pay for executives, including the CBC. Reports at the time said, and I quote, "The main reason cited for the latest raises at the top in Ottawa is to prevent senior government executives from jumping to even more lucrative positions in the private sector," end of quote. And that, open quote, Prime Minister Stephen Harper and his cabinet quietly approved the pay hikes behind the scenes. In the summer doldrums, obviously hoping to keep political flack to a minimum, end of quote. And open quote, in the case of CEOs of crown corporations such as the CBC and Canada Post, the value of the raises and bonuses rivals the total amount that a minimum wage earner would earn in an entire year, end of quote. Let me quote another investigative report from August 2015, and I quote, spending on bonuses and performance pay for the public service executives who implement the government's orders has jumped by more than 65% since Stephen Harper came to power. The average executive performance pay envelope has also risen under the Conservative government. The Conservative government. So the government Poilievre was part of famously gave historic levels of performance pay to CEO level public servants, including the CBC CEO right before leaving. Is that correct?
I'm afraid I can't comment on decisions that were made during a different period. If there's details that we can provide after to the committee, I'll take that. I'll take advice from my staff on that.
And would we?
Thank you. If you have, sorry, just a minute, Mr. Tanzio. If you have any details you can share with us, Ms. Tate, please do so. You can send it forward to the clerk and we'll distribute it to everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's exactly what I was going to suggest. I wanted to pursue with regards to the financing with Mr. Goldblum, as we were doing earlier. So you say that more than 20 million Canadians are using those digital services and now making up for it. I also wanted to know, the government has given CBC Radio-Canada an additional $21 million over the past 3 years. And how has that helped address your financial situation?
Well, like every organization in the country, private or public, where the public broadcaster has been challenged with inflation, which has significantly increased expenses. And also, we talked about before, a decline in revenue. So that support of government funding has been critical to allow the public broadcaster to continue to fulfill its mandate to Canadians, to inform them, to enlighten them, and to provide entertainment to them. You know, this is a challenge that Canadians have faced for almost 90 years now. As technology has changed, each generation has had to determine how best to ensure that Canadians still get to hear their own stories, report on their own news, and celebrate their own culture. So the government support's been critical.
And can you also provide us details with the additional $42 million that the government has invested in the last budget? What are you doing with that additional revenue?
If I may answer that, Madam Chair, the additional $42 million allowed us to put a pause on further job cuts. As you'll remember, we were looking at an additional 420 jobs, and we were able to, as I said, put a pause on that, and also re-engage with some of the independent production commissioning that we had also put a pause on.
So are you out of the woods, and should there be more cuts coming if the budget shortfalls continue in this challenging commercial revenue situation? What happens then?
30 seconds.
The $42 million we received allowed us to balance our budget for this year. Without further funding in the next fiscal year, we would have to be looking at additional job reductions as well as other operational cuts in order to balance our budget.
Thank you.
I have been asked by the members to go to another round. We have very little time, and I have business for this committee to do, which should take 5 minutes. But I think we'll go with a 2-minute round for everyone, beginning with Mr. Ward for 2 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Il me restait une question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had one question left that I would like to ask Ms. Tate. I'm coming back to the bonuses. Was this a choice made by senior management to deliver bonuses? Does CBC Radio Canada have an obligation to hand out bonuses, or can it opt out of this? Does it not have to do this? Can you turn to the board and ask them to grant this? Was this a choice or was it an obligation to provide these bonuses? That is my question. I would say that it was an obligation when you look at the commitment we made vis-à-vis our non-unionized employees. As Ms. Tate has indicated, we set objectives, and employees expect that if they have reached those objectives, that they will be compensated concurrently. So it is a moral obligation, but there is nothing in the law that compels the board to deliver them. It's a debatable subject. Some lawyers would tell us that, yes, we do have a legal obligation because the conditions have been met. But we believe that this was essentially a commitment. We make a commitment towards our unionized employees via the collective agreements, and the non-unionized employees, it is through the objectives that we set, and when these are honored, they are compensated. Thank you.
30 seconds, Mr. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm worried about the CBC. Mr. Goldbloom, you know, I think your CEO was blindsided by the decline of trust in the CBC. In fact, she wrote a defensive editorial last year, Toronto Star. I think she's been blindsided by the gathering of momentum that I read, defund the CBC. And now you're going to go to the government on behalf of the board of CBC and give Ms. Tate 2.5 years a bonus. How can you do this?
I'm sorry, I cannot have an answer. I told everyone we have 2 minutes. We've gone over 2 minutes now on this round. Thank you. I go to the Liberals, to Mr. Noor Mohammed for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Given that we've had, I think, an exhaustive discussion today with Madame Tate and Mr. Goldbloom, for me, there are a couple of key things that I think are worth putting on the record. The first is that Ms. Tate noted that under the Conservatives, the per capita bonuses paid to CBC executives on an inflationary basis were higher under the Harper government than they are now, despite the misinformation that is now already being spread by some conservative-leaning channels. I think it's important for us to remember that. And the other thing that's important to note is that the Harper government also used similar tactics to retain employees. And by the way, I think that's an important thing. I think it's important for us to pay people what they are worth so that they can do good work on behalf of Canadians. And I think that Canadians would respect that good work is paid fairly. With that, Madam Chair, I'd like to now move a motion reflecting the conversation that we've had today that says that given that 11 million Canadians tuned into CBC Radio-Canada's coverage of the Paris 2024 Paralympic Games, and given that the national public broadcaster offered the most coverage in Canada of a Paralympic Games to date, and that given that CBC offers a coverage of sport events that are important to Canadians and our Canadian identity, such as the Arctic Winter Games, the North American Indigenous Games, and the Commonwealth Games, and given that under previous Conservative governments, no 2012 Summer Paralympic sport events were shown live on television despite record international media coverage in other countries, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertook a study of no less than 4 meetings of CBC Radio-Canada's coverage of amateur sport with particular attention to how the public broadcaster provides a Canadian perspective on Canadian stories, highlighting sporting events that would otherwise receive less coverage, unites our country, and helps advance the goals of the Olympic and Paralympic movements. And I will circulate that both, Madam Chair, in both English and French, and if they have not already been done so. But I think this is an important motion, given the questions that we heard that reflect the importance of making sure that Canadians can see sporting events and others that may not be quote unquote popular on some of the mainstream, some of the other channels, but clearly in the eyes of Canadians were not only incredibly popular, but incredibly powerful, and which conveyed an incredible sense of accomplishment across this country from coast to coast to coast of Paralympic athletes. And this is something that I think we should be extremely proud of. And I think we need to really examine the consequences and the implications of this very, very important coverage. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Noor Mohammed, we will not entertain debate on this motion because we didn't get 48 hours notice, and this is not pertaining to compensation. It's pertaining to the Paralympic Games, which is a totally different issue. But we will have this motion on notice to be debated, if the committee so wishes, at the next meeting, or if you want to bring it back at the next meeting. But I want to go to Mr. Shampoo for 2 minutes, please, Martin.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam Chair,
merci.
thank you. I believe that we would be debating the motion because I felt that somewhat freely, broadly was part of today's meeting because it does touch on the mandate of CBC Radio Canada. I thought it would have been interesting to discuss it, but I believe that your decision has been made that we discuss it the next time. Ms. Tate, Mr. Goldblum, once again, thank you very much for appearing before the committee today. And I have very little time, 2.5 minutes to conclude, but I would like to emphasize is that beyond everything that can be leveled against CBC Radio Canada in terms of how it has managed the cuts and the announcements in the last year and a half, how it awards performance bonuses, which is very debatable given this context. I think what needs to be retained here is the overall picture of the situation, not only of CBC Radio Canada, but with respect to all of the information services in the world and in Canada, rather than staying in our own populist positions. And I think we need to face this major problem in an adult and urgent and responsible fashion. I was extremely worried when I was listening to the comments being made. I think this is truth that is being manipulated in order to meet with this popular anger against the public broadcaster, and this is what I heard from the Conservative colleagues. So all of the questions you've asked have found an answer which completely undid their arguments and their rhetoric. And I do hope that this is going to resonate. Certainly, there is the issue of compensation is being questioned. It needs to be reviewed. We need to see how to allow the Quebec and Canadian public to see how important it is to have a healthy public broadcast, but also how important it is to properly compensate the creators, the journalists, the executives, so that we're able to attract quality talent if we want to have a quality public broadcaster. So thank you very much for being here. And I think, Ms. Tate, this might be the last opportunity of us to meet with you during your term. It hasn't always been easy, but you've always faced the music and you're always able to rigorously answer the questions. You're also always in a position to answer questions that you did not have the answer to. We always received information from you later in answer to these questions. These were always very complete, and I think everybody here can testify to the rigor with which you have answered, despite the fact that we might have differences in opinion as to your performance as CEO. This said, however, I sincerely hope that we will be successful in finding a means of ensuring that CBC Radio Canada remains a healthy, rigorous public broadcaster and that it will continue to play an important role to counter this rise of populism and disinformation in the media and the public. Thank you very much.
Now I'm going to go to Ms. Ashton for 2 minutes, please. Sorry, Ms. Tate.
Am I allowed to respond to this?
Go ahead. A quick response. 30 seconds.
I just want to thank Deputy, the member from the Bloc. It has not been easy, especially in the face of extreme misinformation. I learned just minutes ago that on Twitter right now, there are some members claiming that I charge taxpayers for a personal trip to Paris. I just want to say you're all in this room. I made it very clear why I was in Paris as CEO at the Olympic Games, one of the most important events where Canada performed spectacularly. So I just want to say how much I appreciate the deputy's comments about my willingness to be honest and frank and present the facts at this committee.
I might also note that you also said that you paid your trip to Paris on your own dime. Thank you very much. She paid her trip. I'm sorry, we are not debating this issue, Mr. Giovanni. Ashton.
Well, speaking of the Olympics, this summer we were so proud of our Canadian athletes and their successes. But Canadians were also very concerned by the spying scandal that engulfed our women's soccer team, who gave it their all in spite of their officials, who embroiled them in scandal and damaged Canada's reputation when it comes to soccer and, frankly, the ethics of sport on the world stage. Soccer Canada committed to giving us answers weeks, even months ago. We haven't heard anything. Canadians have a lot of questions. Officials of the Canadian soccer team continue to be paid.
This is not
We've heard little from the government and from officials as to what is going on.
I'm sorry, Ms. Ashton. This is actually not in order. This is not what we're discussing right now. We're discussing compensation for the CBC
Madam Chair,
so if you have
this
a
is my
statement or
time.
Yes, thank you.
I do have, this is my speaking time. I have the right to say what I'd like to say during my speaking time.
It is not the order of the day, but go ahead. You have 2 minutes to finish.
And that
you
is
have
why,
1 minute left.
That is why I would like to put forward the following motion, which we submitted last week, which is an updated version of a previous motion we put forward, that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study of no less than 6 hours to study the role of officials associated to the Canadian women's soccer team and Canada Soccer in the use of drones for spying during the Paris Olympics or in previous competitions, which has damaged Canada's reputation and punished the players for something they had no part in. And that the committee summon pursuant to the Standing Order 1081, Bev Priestman, Jasmine Mander, Joseph Lombardi, and John Herdman to appear before committee for no less than 2 hours and before December 11th, 2024, in addition to the Chief Executive Officer and representatives of Soccer Canada and representatives of FIFA and past or present Team Canada soccer players, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House, and that pursuant to Standing Order 109, the committee requests that the government table a comprehensive response to the report. I present this as my right as a member of Parliament in this committee. This is a almost identical version with the exception of the date that's been changed to a previous motion we've submitted. Canadians have answers that haven't been answered, questions that haven't been answered, including from the Minister of Heritage and the Minister of Sport. But I think most importantly, it's important for parliamentarians on behalf of Canadians to seek some accountability and ensure that we are truly supporting our athletes, especially as we gear up for co-hosting the World Cup in 2026. I don't think this should take much more attention than it has. I hope we can move to a vote and move forward on something that Canadians really care about.
Thank you, Ms. Ashton. I would like to take the opportunity before we vote on your motion I want to thank Mr. Goldbloom and Ms. Tate for coming here today, answering tough questions. I think I could repeat what Mr. Shampoo said, but he's absolutely right. You've always been frank and above board and answered the difficult questions and sent us information if you didn't have it on hand. So thank you for coming. I appreciate your time. And so I'm going to now say that the witnesses may leave, and the committee will move to Ms. Ashton's motion. Now, I have been trying to get, thank you very much. I have been trying to get a couple of budgets for these meetings voted on, and it seems that we're not going to be able to do that. So I'd like to put Ms. Ashton's motion is on the table. Anyone wishing to discuss it? I see no hands up for discussion. Yes, Mr. Kurek? No? No? So I'm going to call a vote, and I would like, do you want a recorded vote, Ms. Ashton? Yes, so would the clerk please move to a recorded vote? Thank you.
And the vote is on the motion, Madam Ashton. Mr. Noor Mohammed.
No.
Mr. Coteau. No. Madam Dillon. Madam Gainey.
No.
Madam Natanzio.
No.
Mr. Waugh.
Absolutely, yes.
Mr. Kurek.
Yes.
Mr. Gould.
Oui.
Mr. Giovanni.
Oui.
Mr. Shampoo.
No.
Madam Ashton.
Yes.
That's 5 yeas, 6 nays.
The motion does not carry. So I'm going to now quickly ask the committee to bear with me just for 2 minutes, a minute, actually, to discuss two budgets that I have for you. One is a budget for the study of Canada's anti-racism strategy. The amount is $2,500. Is someone moving to accept this budget or not?
How much is it for?
$2,500, Mr. Cotto.
I'll move it.
Thank you. Everyone, is there anyone against the approval of this budget? No. And the second one would be a budget for the study of senior management compensation at CBC Radio Canada, which we just did. We need to pay for this, and is again $2,250.
I'll move that.
Again, moved by Mr. Cotto. Anyone opposed to this budget? Then the two budgets are passed, and I move that this meeting be adjourned.